Saipan, June 1944. A ridge overlooking the coastal plain. Japanese Type 97 crews peer through their vision slits at the advancing American armor, confident in their positions, secure in their knowledge of tank warfare. They had trained for this. They knew how tanks fought. You stop, you aim, you fire. That was the iron law of armored combat, unchanged since the first tanks rolled across the trenches of France. Then the Shermans opened fire while moving at full speed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Japanese gunners froze, confusion rippling through their crews. Tanks don't do that. Tanks can't do that. The physics of it, the impossibility of aiming a cannon from a platform bouncing over rough terrain at 20 miles per hour, it defied everything they understood about mechanized warfare. Yet the shells were landing. Accurately. Devastatingly. One Type 97 exploded, its thin armor no match for the 75mm round that punched through its glassy plate. Then another. The Japanese crews scrambled to return fire, but their doctrine demanded they halt, stabilize, acquire the target, then shoot. By the time they stopped moving, the Shermans had already fired 3 times. This wasn't supposed to happen. The Type 97 Chiha had been a source of pride when it first rolled off the production lines in 1937, a modern machine that represented Japan's entry into the age of mechanized warfare. Its crews were brave, disciplined, willing to die for the emperor. But courage and discipline couldn't overcome a technological gap so profound that it seemed like sorcery. The Americans had achieved something the Japanese engineers had deemed impossible, unnecessary, a waste of resources. They had created a gun that could hit targets while the tank raced across the battlefield, and in doing so, they had rewritten the rules of armored combat. The question that haunted Japanese tankers for the rest of the war, whispered in the nights before hopeless battles, was simple and terrible. How do you fight an enemy who can kill you before you even have a chance to shoot back? The answer would be written in burning steel across the islands of the Pacific, a lesson learned in blood and fire that would shatter Japan's armored forces and leave its tank crews facing a nightmare they were never prepared for. But to understand how this single technological advantage became a death sentence for Japanese armor, we must journey back to the years before Saipan, to the factories and proving grounds where two nations built their armored forces on entirely different philosophies, racing toward a collision that would prove devastatingly one-sided. The story of how American tanks gained their lethal advantage begins not in the glamour of innovation, but in the grinding pragmatism of industrial war. In the late 1930s, as Europe teetered on the brink of catastrophe, the United States Army watched the rise of mechanized warfare with a mixture of fascination and uncertainty. Tank doctrine was still young, still being written in the dust of training grounds and the blood of early conflicts. The Spanish Civil War had offered glimpses of what armor could do. The German blitzkrieg through Poland and France would soon demonstrate its terrifying potential. But in America, the question was not just what tanks should do, but how to build them in numbers that could matter. The Sherman tank, properly designated the M4 medium tank, emerged from this crucible of necessity. It was not designed to be the best tank in the world. It was designed to be good enough, reliable enough, and above all, producible in staggering quantities. American industry, with its assembly lines and standardized parts, its ability to churn out identical machines by the thousands, demanded a design that could be manufactured in locomotive plants, automobile factories, and shipyards. The Sherman fit that requirement perfectly. Its simple construction, its adaptable chassis, its ease of maintenance, all of these qualities made it the ideal weapon for a nation that understood war as an industrial problem to be solved through overwhelming material superiority. Yet within this philosophy of mass production, American engineers embedded innovations that would prove decisive. The gyroscopic stabilizer, a mechanism that seemed almost magical in its effect, was one such innovation. The concept was straightforward in theory but brutally difficult in execution. A tank in motion experiences constant jolting, swaying, pitching as it traverses uneven ground. These movements throw off any attempt to aim a gun with precision. Traditional doctrine accepted this as an immutable fact. You stopped your tank, let it settle, then fired. The Americans asked a different question. What if you didn't have to stop? The development of the stabilization system began in the late 1930s, driven by engineers who understood that the tank of the future would need to fight on the move. Early experiments were crude, plagued by mechanical failures and limited effectiveness. The stabilizers could only work in one axis, vertical, which meant they could compensate for the tank pitching forward and backward as it rolled over terrain, but not for side-to-side tilting. This limitation meant the system was far from perfect. A Sherman firing on the move was not as accurate as a Sherman firing from a halt. But it was accurate enough to hit large targets like other tanks at combat ranges, and that marginal advantage, that ability to land even one shot in three while racing forward, proved to be revolutionary. By the time production Shermans began rolling off the assembly lines in 1942, the stabilizer was standard equipment, a feature so routine that many American tank crews took it for granted. They trained with it, learned to trust it, developed tactics that exploited it. The doctrine evolved naturally. Advance aggressively, fire on the move to suppress the enemy, close the distance while putting steel downrange. If the first shot missed, fire again. Speed and volume of fire became advantages in themselves, creating a style of combat that favored the aggressor, the tank that kept moving, kept shooting, kept the enemy off balance. Across the Pacific, Japan's approach to armored warfare developed along an entirely different trajectory, shaped by different priorities, different resources, and a fundamentally different understanding of what tanks were meant to accomplish. The Japanese military had observed the rise of armor with interest, but Japan was not a wealthy nation in terms of industrial capacity. Steel was precious, manufacturing capability limited. Every resource poured into tanks was a resource not available for the Navy, the Air Force, the infantry divisions that formed the backbone of Japan's imperial expansion. The result was a compromise, a middle path that sought to balance capability with economy. The Type 97 Chiha, introduced in 1937, embodied this philosophy. It was a light to medium tank, weighing just over 15 tons, armed with a 57mm gun that was adequate for the anti-infantry and light fortification work that Japanese doctrine prioritized. Its armor was thin, rarely exceeding 25mm even on the front glacis, a decision driven by weight considerations and the belief that Japanese tanks would primarily face infantry and fortifications rather than enemy armor. In the context of Japan's early conquests, in China, in Malaya, in the Philippines, this proved sufficient. The Type 97 performed well against opponents who lacked effective anti-tank weapons or armored forces of their own. Japanese tank doctrine reflected these design choices. Tanks were seen as infantry support weapons, mobile gun platforms meant to accompany foot soldiers, suppress strongpoints, and break through defensive lines. Speed and maneuverability mattered more than heavy armor or powerful guns. Crews trained extensively in coordination with infantry, learning to advance methodically, halt to engage targets with precision, then move forward again. The idea of firing on the move was considered wasteful, inaccurate, contrary to the disciplined approach that Japanese military culture valued. A well-aimed shot from a stationary position was worth more than a dozen shots fired wildly while bouncing across rough ground. This doctrine served Japan adequately in the early years of the Pacific War. The opponents they faced, primarily colonial forces and poorly equipped Chinese units, had little in the way of modern armor. Japanese tankers gained experience and confidence, believing their training and tactics to be sound. But this confidence was built on a foundation of limited exposure. They had not yet faced a peer competitor, an enemy whose tanks were not only more numerous but technologically superior in ways that would render traditional doctrine obsolete. The American and Japanese paths to mechanized warfare were converging toward confrontation, but the two sides were racing on entirely different tracks. The United States. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Poured resources into tank production with the single-minded focus of an industrial giant awakening to war. By 1943, Sherman tanks were being produced at a rate that staggered the imagination. Thousands rolled off the assembly lines each month, shipped across the Atlantic to Europe, loaded onto transports bound for the Pacific. This avalanche of steel represented not just quantity but a qualitative edge embedded in every machine. The stabilizer, the reliable engine, the ease of repair, all of these factors compounded into an advantage that went beyond mere numbers. Japan, meanwhile, struggled to keep pace. The Type 97 remained the backbone of the armored forces, but production was slow, constrained by shortages of raw materials and the competing demands of naval construction. Upgrades were attempted. The Type 97 Shinhoto, introduced in 1942, mounted a more powerful 47mm gun, an improvement but still inadequate against the frontal armor of a Sherman. More advanced designs, like the Type 3 Chinu with its 75mm gun, were developed but produced in such limited numbers that they made little impact. By 1944, Japan's armored forces were fighting with machines that were increasingly obsolete, their crews aware of their disadvantages but bound by doctrine and equipment to tactics that were becoming suicidal. The technological gap between the stabilized Sherman and the unstabilized Type 97 might seem like a minor detail, a single feature among many. But in the brutal calculus of armored combat, minor advantages accumulate into matters of life and death. The ability to fire accurately while moving meant the Sherman could dictate the terms of engagement. It could advance, close the distance, put pressure on the enemy, all while delivering fire that forced Japanese crews to button up, to take cover, to lose precious seconds of reaction time. The Type 97, bound by its need to stop and aim, became a stationary target the moment it tried to return fire. Those seconds of immobility were a death sentence. Beyond the technical specifications and production numbers, there was a human element that cannot be ignored. American tank crews, recruited from a society that celebrated mechanical aptitude and innovation, trained on vehicles that rewarded aggressive tactics. They learned to trust their machines, to push them hard, to exploit every advantage the Sherman offered. The culture of American armored units emphasized initiative, adaptability, the willingness to improvise and overcome. This mindset, combined with superior equipment, created a synergy that was greater than the sum of its parts. Japanese tank crews, by contrast, operated within a military culture that valued discipline, obedience, and self-sacrifice above individual initiative. They were brave to the point of recklessness, willing to charge into hopeless situations if ordered, but their training did not prepare them for the kind of fluid, fast-moving combat that the Sherman enabled. The rigid adherence to doctrine, the expectation that tactics proven in China would work against American armor, left them ill-equipped to adapt when the reality of combat shattered their assumptions. The stage was set for a clash that would expose these differences with brutal clarity. As American forces began their island-hopping campaign across the Pacific, pushing toward the Japanese home islands, the encounters between Sherman and Type 97 became inevitable. Each battle would follow a similar pattern, a pattern that Japanese commanders would recognize with growing dread but find themselves unable to counter. The Americans would advance with overwhelming firepower, their tanks moving and shooting, their infantry following close behind. The Japanese would fight with desperate courage, their Type 97s engaging from prepared positions, their crews knowing they were outmatched but refusing to yield. The outcome was foreordained, written in the specifications of machinery and the doctrines that govern their use. The Solomon Islands, New Guinea, the Philippines, each campaign brought new iterations of the same tragic story. Japanese tanks would be dug in, positioned to ambush, their crews waiting with the patience of men who knew they were likely to die. The Shermans would come, and the Japanese would open fire, landing hits that sometimes damaged but rarely destroyed the American machines. Then the Shermans would return fire, moving, advancing, their stabilizers allowing them to land accurate shots even as they maneuvered for better positions. The Type 97s, forced to choose between staying mobile and aiming accurately, would be picked apart one by one. In the aftermath of these engagements, American crews would climb out of their Shermans, inspect the damage, perhaps count themselves lucky if the Japanese guns had only scarred the armor rather than penetrating it. They would see the burning wrecks of Type 97s scattered across the battlefield, thin armor peeled back by 75mm shells, crews dead at their posts. Some felt pity. Others felt relief. Most simply felt the grim satisfaction of having survived another day in a war that seemed to have no end. For the Japanese survivors, those rare crews who managed to escape their destroyed tanks, the experience was traumatic in ways that went beyond the physical danger. They had trained for years, believed in their equipment, trusted in their doctrine. To see it all rendered meaningless by an enemy who could do the impossible, who could shoot accurately while racing forward, was a psychological blow as devastating as any shell. Some reported their experiences to their superiors, trying to convey the reality of what they had faced. Others said nothing, knowing that the truth would sound like cowardice or exaggeration. Japanese command struggled to respond. Reports of American tanks firing on the move were met with skepticism at first. Surely the reports were mistaken, the product of confusion in the heat of battle. Tanks could not fire accurately while moving. It was physically impossible. But as the reports multiplied, as more and more units described the same phenomenon, the truth became undeniable. The Americans had achieved something the Japanese had not thought possible, and they were using it to devastating effect. Attempts were made to counter the Shermans' advantage. New tactics were developed, emphasizing ambushes from concealed positions at close range where the Sherman stabilizer advantage would be minimized. Anti-tank teams were trained to target the Shermans with mines, satchel charges, anything that could stop them before they could bring their guns to bear. Some units experimented with suicide tactics, ramming attacks where a Type 97 would attempt to crash into a Sherman at full speed, sacrificing itself to disable the enemy. These desperate measures sometimes succeeded on a tactical level, destroying individual Shermans, but they could not change the strategic reality. The Americans had more tanks, better tanks, and they were willing to accept losses that would have been unthinkable for the resource-starved Japanese military. By mid-1944, as American forces closed in on the Mariana Islands, the stage was set for what would become one of the most one-sided armor confrontations of the Pacific War. Saipan, a heavily fortified island that Japanese commanders considered essential to the defense of the home islands, would see Japanese armor make its last significant stand. The Type 97 crews stationed there knew what was coming. They had heard the stories from other islands, seen the reports of Shermans that seemed unstoppable. Yet they prepared their positions, checked their ammunition, said their prayers, and waited for the Americans to come. The strategic importance of Saipan cannot be overstated. The island sat within bomber range of the Japanese mainland, and its capture would provide the Americans with airfields from which B-29 superfortresses could launch devastating raids on Japanese cities and industry. For Japan, losing Saipan would be a catastrophe, opening the door to the final phase of the war. For the Americans, taking it was a necessary step, one more island in the long chain that led to Tokyo. The battle would be fierce, the casualties heavy on both sides, but the outcome was never truly in doubt. The Japanese garrison on Saipan included approximately 50 Type 97 tanks, along with a handful of the newer Type 95 light tanks. These were organized into several companies, positioned at key points across the island to counterattack any American landing. The commanders knew they could not win a battle of maneuver against the Shermans. Their only hope was to use the terrain, to force the Americans into kill zones where the Type 97s could fire from prepared positions before being destroyed. It was a strategy born of desperation, a recognition that survival was impossible but that perhaps, through sacrifice, they could inflict enough damage to slow the American advance. The American forces preparing to invade Saipan included the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions, supported by the Army's 27th Infantry Division. Among their equipment were hundreds of Sherman tanks, including the newer M4A2 and M4A3 variants with improved armor and more powerful engines. The Marines had learned hard lessons about amphibious assaults, about the need to get armor ashore quickly to support the infantry in breaking through beach defenses. The Shermans would be critical to that mission, acting as mobile pillboxes, breaching obstacles, suppressing enemy strongpoints while the infantry advanced. As the invasion fleet approached Saipan in mid-June, the final preparations were made. Sherman crews checked their equipment, loaded ammunition, ran through their pre-combat routines. Some were veterans of previous campaigns, men who had fought at Tarawa or Kwajalein, who knew the particular hell of island warfare. Others were replacements, young men fresh from training, about to experience combat for the first time. All of them understood that the coming battle would be brutal, that the Japanese would fight for every yard of ground, that survival would require not just courage but luck. On the Japanese side, Type 97 crews made their own preparations. They positioned their tanks in revetments, camouflaged them with vegetation, ranged their guns on likely approach routes. Officers gave final instructions, reminding their men of their duty to the emperor, of the honor that came with dying in battle. Some crews wrote final letters home, knowing they would never be delivered but finding comfort in the act of writing them. Others prayed at small shrines, seeking courage for what was to come. All of them knew, though few would speak it aloud, that they were facing an enemy whose technological superiority made victory impossible. The best they could hope for was to sell their lives dearly, to take a few Americans with them into death. The invasion of Saipan began on June 15, 1944, with a massive naval bombardment that turned the beaches and the hills beyond into an inferno of high explosive and fire. Japanese coastal defenses were pounded into rubble, strongpoints obliterated, communication lines severed. But as the Marines came ashore, they quickly learned that the bombardment had not destroyed the Japanese will to resist. Machine gun nests opened up from concealed positions, mortar fire rained down on the beaches, and hidden artillery pieces began picking off landing craft. The Marines pushed inland, taking heavy casualties, calling desperately for armor support. The Shermans came ashore in the second and third waves, rolling off landing craft into the surf, churning up the beaches past burning vehicles and dead men, their presence immediately changing the dynamics of the battle. Where the Marines had been pinned down by Japanese fire, the Shermans advanced, their machine guns raking enemy positions, their 75mm guns demolishing bunkers and pillboxes. The Marines followed, using the tanks as cover, advancing yard by bloody yard into the interior of the island. For the first day, the Japanese armor stayed hidden, waiting for the moment when the American advance would extend beyond the support of naval gunfire, when the tanks would be separated from their infantry, vulnerable. Japanese commanders watched and waited, knowing that patience was their only advantage, that striking too soon would waste their limited armor in piecemeal engagements that could not affect the outcome. The Type 97 crews sat in their tanks, engines silent, vision slits closed, listening to the thunder of battle growing closer. The moment came on the second day of the invasion, as American forces pushed inland toward the first line of Japanese defensive positions. A Marine battalion, supported by a company of Shermans, advanced up a valley toward what intelligence had identified as a Japanese command post. The terrain was difficult, the valley sides steep and covered with dense vegetation that concealed the Japanese positions. The Shermans moved cautiously, their commanders scanning for threats, aware that ambush was likely. Behind them, the Marine infantry spread out, weapons ready, expecting contact at any moment. The Japanese struck from three sides simultaneously, a carefully coordinated ambush that sent 9 Type 97 tanks surging from concealed positions, their 57mm guns blazing. At close range, the opening volley was devastating. One Sherman took a hit to its side armor and burst into flames, its crew bailing out frantically as ammunition began cooking off inside the hull. Another was hit in the tracks and ground to a halt, immobilized but still fighting. The Marines hit the dirt, returning fire with rifles and machine guns, trying to suppress the Japanese infantry that emerged alongside the tanks. But the American response was swift and overwhelming. The remaining Shermans, rather than retreating or seeking cover, accelerated forward, their stabilizers allowing them to return fire even as they maneuvered. The Marine tank commanders had trained for this, had been taught to trust their equipment, to exploit the advantage that mobility and accurate fire gave them. They did not stop to aim carefully. They simply pointed their guns at the enemy tanks and fired, again and again, the stabilizers compensating for the rough terrain, the shells flying true even as the Shermans bounced and swayed. The Type 97 crews, committed to their attack, tried desperately to bring their guns to bear on the moving Shermans. They halted, traversed their turrets, acquired targets through their crude sights. Some got shots off, but the seconds they spent stationary were fatal. The Sherman's 75mm guns had a devastating effect on the thin armor of the Type 97s. One Japanese tank took a direct hit to its turret, the shell punching clean through and detonating inside, killing the crew instantly. Another was struck in the hull, the explosion breaking the tank's back and leaving it a burning wreck. Within minutes, 5 of the 9 Type 97s were destroyed, their smoking hulls testament to the lethality of the Shermans' fire. The surviving Japanese tanks attempted to withdraw, to break contact and escape before they too were destroyed. But the Shermans pursued, still firing on the move, refusing to give the enemy time to regroup. 2 more Type 97s were hit as they retreated, one rolling to a stop with its engine destroyed, the other veering wildly before crashing into a ravine. The last 2 disappeared into the jungle, their crews in shock, unable to comprehend what had just happened. They had executed their ambush perfectly, achieved surprise, landed the first blows. Yet within minutes they had been annihilated, torn apart by an enemy who fought in ways that defied everything they understood about tank combat. For the Marine tankers, the engagement was validation of their training and their equipment. They had lost 2 Shermans, suffered casualties, but they had broken a Japanese counterattack and destroyed most of an enemy tank company. As they regrouped, some crews climbed out to inspect the wrecks of the Type 97s, marveling at how thin the armor was, how primitive the interior layout seemed compared to their own tanks. They felt a mixture of respect for the bravery of the Japanese crews who had charged into almost certain death, and relief that the technological disparity was so heavily in their favor. News of the engagement spread quickly through both forces. For the Americans, it confirmed what they already believed, that their armor was superior, that aggressive tactics would prevail. For the Japanese, it was a confirmation of their worst fears. The reports from survivors were stark. The American tanks had fired while moving. Accurately. Devastatingly. There was no counter, no tactic that could overcome this advantage. To engage a Sherman in open combat was suicide. All that remained was to die as effectively as possible, to make the Americans pay for every yard of ground and blood, even if the blood was mostly Japanese. Over the following days, the pattern repeated across Saipan. Japanese Type 97s would attempt to counterattack, would achieve brief moments of tactical success, would then be overwhelmed by the Sherman's combination of numbers, firepower, and the crucial ability to shoot on the move. Some Japanese crews fought with extraordinary courage, ramming their tanks into Shermans when their guns failed, or deliberately drawing fire to allow infantry to close with satchel charges. These acts of desperation sometimes succeeded in destroying individual American tanks, but they could not change the trajectory of the battle. The human cost was staggering on both sides, though disproportionately so for the Japanese. American tankers died in their vehicles when lucky Japanese shots penetrated vulnerable spots, when hidden anti-tank guns landed perfect hits, when suicide attackers succeeded in their mission. Each loss was mourned, each empty seat a reminder that even superior equipment did not guarantee survival. But for every American tank destroyed, 3 or 4 Type 97s were turned into burning scrap. The mathematics of attrition favored the Americans so heavily that the outcome was never in question. Japanese tank crews, knowing they were doomed, fought with a fatalism that their American opponents found both terrifying and pitiable. Some charged alone at entire platoons of Shermans, their guns firing until the moment they were blown apart. Others positioned their tanks as static pillboxes, welding the hatches shut and fighting until they were buried under rubble or incinerated by flamethrower tanks. A few crews, their tanks disabled and surrounded, committed suicide rather than surrender, a final act of defiance against an enemy they could not defeat. By the time Saipan was declared secure in early July, nearly every Japanese tank on the island had been destroyed. The survivors, those few Type 97 crews who had managed to escape or hide their vehicles, were hunted down in the final days of the campaign. The American armor had proven itself decisively, not just in destroying enemy tanks but in supporting the infantry advance, in breaking through defensive lines, in providing the mobile firepower that turned the tide in dozens of small engagements across the island. The battle for Saipan became a case study in the importance of technological advantage in modern warfare. The gyroscopic stabilizer, that seemingly small innovation, had proven to be a decisive factor. It had allowed American tankers to fight in ways that Japanese doctrine had never anticipated, to move and shoot simultaneously, to maintain aggression and momentum even under fire. The Type 97, brave crews and all, had been rendered obsolete not by any failing of courage or tactical skill, but by a gap in technology that no amount of fighting spirit could bridge. For Japan, the loss of Saipan and the destruction of its armored forces, there was a catastrophe that resonated far beyond the tactical level. It demonstrated that Japan could not compete with American industrial might, could not match the innovation and production capacity that allowed the United States to field superior equipment in overwhelming numbers. The myth of Japanese invincibility, already badly damaged, shattered completely. Saipan's fall led directly to the resignation of Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, a political earthquake that signaled Japan's leaders were beginning to understand that the war was lost. The story of the Sherman's stabilized gun and the Type 97's tragic inadequacy is more than a tale of machines and battles. It is a story about how wars are won and lost, about the importance of innovation, industrial capacity, and the willingness to challenge accepted doctrine. The Americans succeeded not because they built perfect tanks, but because they built tanks that were good enough, produced them in massive numbers, and equipped them with features that gave their crews tangible advantages in combat. The Japanese failed not because their soldiers lacked courage, but because their nation's limited resources and conservative military doctrine left them fighting with equipment that was obsolete before the war even began. In the decades since, military historians have studied the Pacific tank battles extensively, drawing lessons that remain relevant today. The importance of investing in technology that provides even marginal advantages. The danger of assuming that courage and discipline can overcome material disadvantages. The reality that wars between industrial powers are won as much in factories as on battlefields. The Sherman vs. Type 97 matchup stands as a stark example of all these principles, a cautionary tale about the price of falling behind in the arms race that modern warfare demands. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the volcanic soil of Saipan, turning the interior of every tank into a furnace. Inside the Shermans, American crews stripped down to undershirts, sweat pouring off them. As they maneuvered through the broken landscape, the smell was overwhelming, a mixture of cordite, diesel fumes, and the sickly sweet stench of decay that hung over the battlefield. Visibility through the periscopes was limited, dust and smoke reducing the world to shadowy shapes that might be rocks, trees, or enemy soldiers. Every advance was a gamble, every bend in the trail a potential ambush point. Lieutenant Thomas Chen commanded a Sherman from the Marine Corps' 4th Tank Battalion, a veteran of Roynamore who had learned the hard lessons of island warfare through experience rather than manuals. His crew consisted of 4 other men, each one essential to the tank's survival. Corporal Mike Kowalski served as gunner, a former factory worker from Detroit whose hands moved across the controls with the same precision he had once applied to assembly line work. Private First Class Danny Rodriguez loaded the main gun, a job that required both strength and speed as he hefted the heavy 75mm rounds from their racks. Sergeant Bill Harrison drove, his face pressed against the narrow vision slit, calling out obstacles over the intercom. Private Eddie Walsh operated the bow machine gun and assisted with navigation, his eyes constantly scanning for threats. They had been fighting for 6 days, advancing yard by yard through a landscape that seemed designed to kill them. Japanese resistance had stiffened as the Marines pushed deeper inland, every ridge and ravine contested with a ferocity that shocked even the veterans. The tank crews had seen things that would haunt them, images burned into memory that no amount of time would fully erase. Dead Marines laid out in rows awaiting burial. Japanese soldiers emerging from caves to charge with bayonets fixed, screaming as machine gun fire cut them down. Civilian casualties, women and children caught in the crossfire of a battle they never asked to be part of. Chen Sherman, nicknamed Iron Phoenix after surviving a direct hit at Roynamore that had killed the previous commander, rolled forward along a narrow trail that wound between steep hillsides covered in dense vegetation. The terrain was perfect for ambush, and Chen felt his stomach tighten with anticipation. Intelligence reported that a Japanese strongpoint lay ahead, anchored by several Type 97 tanks dug into concealed positions. The battalion's mission was to punch through this defensive line and open the way for the infantry to advance on the next objective, a ridge that overlooked the entire Central Valley. Behind Iron Phoenix, 3 more Shermans followed in column, their commanders maintaining visual contact despite the dust that billowed up from the treads. The rumble of engines echoed off the hillsides, announcing their presence to any enemy within a mile. Stealth was impossible in a tank. The best you could hope for was to move fast enough that the enemy couldn't prepare an effective response before you were on top of them. The radio crackled in Chen's headset, the battalion commander's voice distorted by static. All units be advised, enemy armor reported in your sector. Rules of engagement remain unchanged. Advance and destroy. Chen acknowledged and switched to his crew's internal circuit. Stay sharp, everyone. They're out there somewhere. Kowalski, you see anything that looks like a tank, you put a round through it. No hesitation. The gunner's response was calm, professional. Roger that, LT gun is hot and ready. The trail opened into a small clearing, perhaps 200 yards across, with the hillsides pressing close on either side. Chen's instincts screamed warning. This was a kill zone, a natural funnel where enemy fire could concentrate. He was about to order Harrison to back up, to find an alternate route, when movement caught his eye. Vegetation falling away from a revetment on the right hillside, and behind it the angular shape of a Type 97, its gun already traversing toward them. Contact right. Chen shouted, his voice tight with adrenaline. Kowalski, don't wait for my order, fire. The Sherman's 75mm gun roared, the stabilizer compensating as Harrison instinctively accelerated, the tank surging forward rather than stopping. The first round went high, impacting the hillside above the Japanese tank in a spray of dirt and rock. Rodriguez already had the next shell loaded, slamming it home and calling clear. Kowalski fired again, the gun bucking in its mount, and this time the round struck true. The Type 97's thin glassy plate offered no resistance. The armor-piercing shell punched through and detonated inside, the explosion lifting the turret several inches before it settled back askew, smoke pouring from every opening. But the ambush had only begun. 2 more Type 97s revealed themselves, one on each hillside, their positions carefully chosen to create a crossfire. The Japanese had learned from previous encounters, had positioned their tanks where the Shermans would be forced to divide their attention, unable to engage all threats simultaneously. The Type 97 on the left fired first, its 57mm round screaming across the clearing to strike Iron Phoenix on the frontal armor. The impact rang through the tank like a hammer blow, and for a moment Chen thought they were finished. But the Sherman's armor held, the round deflecting upward, leaving a deep gouge but failing to penetrate. Harrison, evasive maneuvers. Chen ordered, and the driver threw the tank into a hard turn, the treads chewing up the ground as the Sherman pivoted. The gyroscopic stabilizer whined with the effort of keeping the gun on target despite the violent movement. Kowalski tracked the left hillside Type 97, his hands steady on the controls, waiting for the brief moment when the reticle aligned with the enemy tank. The stabilizer gave him that moment, that split-second window that a conventional tank would never have had while moving at speed. He fired. The round caught the Type 97 in the turret ring, the weakest point in its armor, and the explosion was catastrophic. The turret blew completely off the hull, tumbling down the hillside in a shower of sparks and debris. The hull itself erupted in flames as ammunition cooked off, secondary explosions tearing the thin armor apart from the inside. The third Type 97, positioned on the right hillside behind a fallen tree, had a clear shot at Iron Phoenix's side armor. The Japanese gunner fired, and this time the round found a weak spot. It struck the Sherman just below the turret, penetrating the thinner side armor and slamming into the interior. The explosion was deafening, confined within the steel box. Rodriguez screamed, clutching his leg where shrapnel had torn through flesh. The acrid smell of burning filled the compartment, and Chen felt blood running down his face from a cut he didn't remember receiving. But the Sherman's engine still roared, its systems still functioned. Chen wiped blood from his eyes and shouted into the intercom. Still in the fight. Kowalski, get that last bastard. Rodriguez, you with us? The loader's voice was strained with pain but determined. Still here, sir. Guns ready. The 4th Sherman in their column had cleared the bend in the trail and now had a firing angle on the remaining Type 97. Its commander, a lieutenant named Jackson, didn't hesitate. His gunner put 3 rounds into the Japanese tank in rapid succession, firing on the move just as they had been trained. The Type 97 never got a chance to relocate. The first round disabled its gun, the second penetrated the hull, and the third was unnecessary, fired into a tank already burning. The ambush had lasted less than 2 minutes. 4 Japanese tanks destroyed for the price of damage to 1 Sherman and 1 wounded crewman. Chin ordered his tank to pull back while the other Shermans secured the clearing. Medics rushed forward to treat Rodriguez, applying tourniquets and morphine while the loader gritted his teeth against the pain. The wound would take him out of action, would probably send him home, but he would live. As Chin climbed out of the turret to assess the damage to his tank, he looked at the burning wrecks of the Type 97s scattered around the clearing. The Japanese crews had fought bravely, had executed their ambush well, had even managed to land hits. But it hadn't been enough. The Sherman's ability to return accurate fire while moving had turned what should have been a devastating ambush into a one-sided slaughter. He felt no triumph, only a weary acknowledgement of the mathematical inevitability that governed tank combat. Better equipment, better training, and a technological advantage that the enemy had no way to counter. The clearing was secured, and the advance continued. Jackson's Sherman took the lead while Iron Phoenix fell back for repairs. The remaining Japanese resistance in the sector collapsed over the next few hours as more Shermans arrived, overwhelming the scattered Type 97s that tried to hold the line. By nightfall, the strongpoint had fallen, and the Marines were digging in on the next ridge, artillery already beginning to pound the subsequent line of Japanese defenses. For the Japanese tank crews who survived that day, the experience was a descent into nightmare. Corporal Takeshi Yamamoto had commanded a Type 97 position on a hillside overlooking a different section of the American advance. His crew consisted of 3 other men, all of them young, none older than 23. They had been in position for 2 days, waiting in their camouflaged revetment, rationing water and food, listening to the sounds of battle growing closer. The heat inside the tank was unbearable, the smell of unwashed bodies and stale air oppressive, but they endured because that was their duty. When the Shermans finally appeared, rolling up the valley below their position, Yamamoto felt his heart hammering against his ribs. This was the moment they had trained for, the moment when they would prove their worth to the Emperor and to their ancestors. His gunner, a thin young man named Sato, peered through his sight, tracking the lead Sherman as it approached. The driver, Corporal Nakamura, sat ready at his controls, engine running at idle to avoid giving away their position with exhaust smoke. The loader, Private Tanaka, crouched beside the main gun with a 57mm round already in his arms, ready to feed the weapon the moment the first shot was fired. Yamamoto waited until the lead Sherman was at optimal range, close enough that even the Type 97's modest gun could penetrate, far enough that they might have time to fire multiple shots before the Americans could respond. He gave the order. Fire. Sato pressed the trigger, and the Type 97 bucked as the 57mm gun roared. The round struck the Sherman's front glacis, right where the armor was thickest, and ricocheted off in a shower of sparks. The American tank didn't even slow down. Instead, it accelerated, turning toward them, and Yamamoto felt ice flood his veins as he realized the Sherman was firing back while still moving. The first American round went wide, impacting the hillside 20 meters to their left. But even as Tanaka was loading the next Japanese shell, even as Sato was adjusting his aim, the Sherman fired again. This second round struck the Type 97's turret dead center. The armor, never designed to withstand such punishment, shattered. The shell penetrated and detonated inside the fighting compartment. Yamamoto never heard the explosion. One moment he was staring through his commander's periscope, watching the Sherman's gun flash, and the next there was only pain and darkness. When awareness returned, he was lying in the dirt 15 meters from where his tank had been, his uniform on fire, his left arm bent at an angle that made no sense. Sato was dead, his body still inside the turret, incinerated in the initial blast. Nakamura had been thrown clear but died from his wounds within minutes, blood pouring from ears and nose, internal organs ruptured by the overpressure. Tanaka had survived the explosion but lost both legs below the knee, and he screamed and screamed until shock took him into merciful unconsciousness. Yamamoto tried to crawl toward his men, tried to help them, but his body wouldn't obey. He lay there in the dirt, watching as more Shermans rolled past, as American infantry advanced, as his entire world collapsed. Other Japanese soldiers found him later, dragged him to a cave that served as a field hospital, where a medic with no supplies and no hope did what he could. The arm would have to come off, the medic said. Without proper tools, without anesthesia, using a saw meant for cutting wood. Yamamoto begged them to just let him die, but they wouldn't allow it. He had survived, and survivors had a duty to report what they had seen. The reports from tank crews like Yamamoto's filtered up through the Japanese command structure, each one describing the same impossible phenomenon. The American tanks fired while moving accurately. The consensus among Japanese officers was disbelief followed by despair. If the reports were true, and increasingly it seemed they were, then there was no tactic that could overcome such an advantage. Japanese tanks would have to stop to fire, making themselves stationary targets. American tanks could keep moving, keep firing, dictate the terms of every engagement. It was a mismatch so fundamental that courage and skill became irrelevant. Some Japanese commanders advocated for abandoning tank versus tank combat entirely, instead using the Type 97s as mobile pillboxes, dug in and camouflaged, waiting for the Shermans to come within point-blank range before firing. This tactic achieved limited success, destroying a handful of American tanks, but it was fundamentally defensive, reactive, and it condemned each Type 97 crew to a static death. Once their position was revealed by that first shot, every American tank and artillery piece in range would focus fire on them until nothing remained but smoking wreckage. Other commanders pushed for more aggressive tactics, for mass charges that would overwhelm the Shermans through sheer numbers. But Japan didn't have the numbers. Each Type 97 lost was irreplaceable, while the Americans seemed to have an endless supply of Shermans. The battle of attrition was hopelessly one-sided, and everyone knew it. The tank crews knew it. The infantry supporting them knew it. Even the generals planning the defenses knew it, though few would speak such defeatist thoughts aloud. As the campaign on Saipan ground toward its inevitable conclusion, the pattern of tank combat remained consistent. Shermans advanced, Type 97s attempted to resist, and the Japanese tanks were systematically destroyed. The losses were not entirely one-sided. American tank crews died when lucky Japanese shots found vulnerable points, when hidden anti-tank guns achieved surprise, when desperate infantry assaults succeeded in their suicidal mission to plant explosives on Sherman hulls. But for every American tank knocked out, 3 or 4 Japanese tanks were annihilated. The psychological impact on both sides was profound. American tank crews developed a confidence bordering on invincibility. They had faced the enemy's best armor and found it wanting. The Shermans, so often criticized in Europe for being undergunned and underarmored compared to German Tigers and Panthers, were absolute masters of the Pacific battlefield. The crews learned to trust their machines, to exploit every advantage the stabilized gun provided, to fight with an aggression that Japanese doctrine had no answer for. Japanese tankers, conversely, descended into a fatalism that sapped their effectiveness even when material conditions might have allowed for limited success. Why bother with careful tactics when the outcome was predetermined? Why conserve ammunition when you were going to die anyway? Some crews fought with reckless abandon, charging headlong at superior forces in the hope of achieving something, anything, before they were destroyed. Others simply went through the motions, following orders because that was what soldiers did, but without any belief that their actions mattered. The final large-scale tank engagement on Saipan occurred on July 7, 1944, as part of a desperate Japanese counterattack that military historians would later recognize as one of the largest banzai charges of the Pacific War. Over 3,000 Japanese soldiers, supported by the last operational Type 97 tanks on the island, launched a night assault against American positions in the northern sector. The attack was born of desperation, a last attempt to break the American encirclement and change the course of a battle already lost. The Type 97s led the charge, their engines roaring as they barreled down roads and across open fields toward American lines. They fired on the move, not because they had any ability to aim accurately while racing forward, but because there was no time for careful gunnery, no time for anything but speed and momentum. Behind them came waves of infantry, many armed only with rifles and bayonets, some carrying nothing but bamboo spears, all of them screaming as they charged into American machine gun fire. The Marine positions erupted in response. Artillery illumination rounds turned night into day, revealing the oncoming horde. Machine guns opened up, their tracers creating walls of fire that the Japanese charged through, accepting horrific casualties for each yard gained. The Shermans, positioned in defensive hold-down positions, began firing at maximum range, their stabilizers allowing them to engage the moving Type 97s with a degree of accuracy that the Japanese could not hope to match. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.